Yo, what is up everybody? So, first edition's around the corner. We've been playing the base set meta for forever now. But I wanted to take a look at a kind of a retrospective today of the very first Elestrals tournament in the community. This isn't the prototype starter decks, this isn't the starter deck tournament. I'm legitimately the very first Elestrals tournament we had. We had maybe 2/3 of the set, roughly 80 cards available. Things like Viserys didn't exist yet. And we were playing the game because we were playtesting. We wanted to play the game. We put it on Tabletop Simulator, just enjoying, have fun with it. And ultimately, the Tabletop Simulator community, these tournaments, and just gameplay that we had helped make the game a better game. But I want to see, or at least take a retrospective look at where we came from, the decks people played, and kind of compare it to modern Elestrals right now, with almost 2 years later, which is crazy to think about. Elestrals has been announced for 2 years, and so it's coming out officially, full release, first edition, in a week or so. People are going to get the shipments, right? They just announced that it docked in the US. So yeah, without further ado, let's go jump into what people were playing in their first Elestrals tournament and just take a peek at it. Starting here, you'll recognize the name, I would hope. Gigan's Eruption Burning Panda deck. 9 wins, 10 losses. First off, Panda Burn is a meme right now. It's always been a meme, right? Eruption, Panda, Eruption. It's always been a little bit of a meme, but it's funny to think people were actually playing this deck. And you'll look at the deck construction: 3 Necra, fine. 3 Kinleo, I guess, right? 2 Leonite, 3 Pennisons, 3 Equal Links, 2 Krakatuga. The ratios are 12-1 cost to 4-2 cost, which is bare minimum on the 1 cost ratio there, I would say, but they're also, a lot of them are out of element for the 2 cost, so you can't really send them well. It's a little all over the place. The deck is obviously a Burn deck. The Krakatuga is a little clunky because you can only really get a Necra for Kinleo efficiently. There's an Equalinx and Demeter in there to punch over things, that's still relevant, right? Ambrosia, Nectar of Gods, Shield of Achilles. I will make a note, that was the original Shield of Achilles, the 2 cost shields for everything, which definitely needed that nerf. 2 Hephaestus. Hephaestus never changed. Poison Tipped Arrow, that's old Poison Tipped Arrow. Scythe of Demeters. Why in this deck? To go with Equalinx, I guess. Eruptions, Volcanic Forges. The deck is all over the place. 3 Nectar Gods is, okay. I think the really interesting takeaway with this is you'll notice Gorgon's Gaze in the sideboard at 3. Because Gorgon's Gaze used to play completely differently, not because it got it got one change. The only change Gorgon's Gaze got was that it was added the negate keyword and the suppress keyword. It used to just basically prevent Elestrals from abilities from activating. It got really complex because Gorgon's is just a ruling nightmare at the time, and the rules actually changed around Gorgon's Gaze, and that made Gorgon's Gaze a 3 of playable in every deck now. Which is interesting to think, because back in the day, those people played it, but it wasn't insane nowadays. Now it's just one of the best counter runes in the game. It used to be debatable putting into your deck. I don't want to spend too much time on one deck at a time, but let's just jump into the next deck. Axiom's Counter Control. 12 Elestrals. Now, this is kind of akin to Little Guy Stall that we had a couple tournaments ago, where it's 4 Elestrals that are generally built around just playing super efficiently. So it's Vertaqua, Pigas, Bandison, Sorlet, just really efficient, small Elestrals, popping back row, hitting over defense things, right? And then it's got a bunch of runes, and the whole deck idea here was just outvalue your opponent with your counter runes and removal and punch them for 1 over and over and over again. So you play Pigas, Earthquake, whatever their 1-drop is, punch them for 1. Shield or Gorgons or whatnot, they're the Elestral that they play, punch them for 1, and just advantage your opponent in that way. This deck probably would still work okay today. The issue is there's a little bit more aggressive bodies, again, Viserys didn't exist. 1 Viserys connecting against this deck basically ruins the strategy of kind of 1-for-1 and punching for 1 over and over again. But it's an interesting deck to take a look at. It main deck basically every counter rune, including Pandora's Box, which is unchanged. It has 2 Gorgon's Gaze, and in the sideboard it had the 1 Gorgon's Gaze and the 3rd Pandora's Box to make up for those, but it ran basically all the removal that we see still today, and also Tornado, which I felt was interesting and of note to point out here. But yeah, this deck actually came in second, I believe. We'll get into the standings at the end. But yeah, the deck did pretty well because it was kind of a surprise deck at the time of just, I'm going to play all these counter runes super efficiently and punch you for one, and then punch you for one, and then punch you for one until you die. Very interesting deck. It was super frustrating to play against at the time. It would probably still work today with some changes, but it was really interesting at the time. Sonicore deck. We still see Sonicore decks, but things get interesting. So there's Godabolt in this deck, which is Godabolt. There's 25 main deck Elestrals, which is a huge amount. Like, you don't see that count in decks anymore. Like, people top out at 20, maybe like 18. No one plays 25 Elestrals, so that's of note in this deck. Sonicores, Boombats, Quackles, Signectrix, Rice Arrows, Ash Rabbit, and Pup-Gadabult, Sparkets. I will note that there's 3 Signectric here, and you might know there's no Imperial, so why are you playing Signectric? Signectric used to be a 2-cost version of Tectorus and Valkyries, so that's why it's in the deck. We thought 2 costs were better at the time, right? Sonicore was still like goated. It still does the same things. So this deck was mostly like Sonicore, Thunderbolt to Zeus shenanigans. You'll see Sparket in there. You have the Sparket Zeus combo. Sparket was different, which we'll go into a little bit later. Otherwise, every card here is pretty much the same as it is currently. It's just, look at the deck. It's completely like, there's no counter runes in this deck, right? 3 Thunderbolt to Zeus, 3 Resting on Your Laurels. Laurels got some changes, but basically did the same thing. Ambrosia's Circle the Sky. This is just an all-in aggro deck with Sonicore trying to just burn your opponent with a giant hit over counter runes, which this probably could still exist. You change the deck drastically though. Just pure Thunder. No one plays pure decks right now. Even like an Imperial deck still splashes spirits of other elements, and the runes don't even have many counter runes. You have what? The only counter runes in this deck are Gorgon's Gaze. And again, Gorgon's Gaze back in the day didn't do as much as it does now. So it's the deck did well, obviously. 8 wins, 11 losses over the course of the tournament. But that's just because it's a super aggressive deck. With Sonicore, we didn't really have the same deck building principles. It's interesting to look at though. Summer wins. This is the original Boogeyman best deck for a very long time because, well, he just 14 wins, 3 losses, right? So this deck very much looks like this modern deck with some changes, right? 15 1-drop Elestrals, fair enough. It's an aggressive deck. It was a burn deck. Torlet, Pegas, Exaltair, Necroth, Panacin, all those do the exact same thing they do now. But then we have the runes, 3 Aeolus. So you'll notice the Aeolus in this image is a disenchant 1 wind. This was the last like hurrah of the Aeolus 1 card. I believe Aeolus actually got nerfed before this tournament happened. I believe the Aeolus got nerfed to 2 Spirit Disenchant for search, but we kept it as 1 Spirit because the decks were already made, etc. But I'm pretty sure this Aeolus got nerfed right before this tournament started, or maybe right during it. The Aeolus was 1 cost to search, making it brutally strong. Bag of Wind's a little bit weird, but Bag of Wind is getting some resurgence now, which is interesting to see. Earthquakes, Eruptions, Hephaestus, Poison Tipped Arrows, Nectar Gods, and Bird Shields. Like, you could bring this deck to a tournament today, and it would see play. It's similar enough to a modern deck that it could be played probably still. You'd make some changes. The sideboard's a little interesting. Like, I mean, sideboard right there. 3 Gorgon's Gazes. Why are they in the sideboard? Because Gorgon's Gaze again wasn't as good as it was now, which is crazy. Like, everyone has Gorgon's Gaze in their sideboard because people are like, oh, it's a good card, but it's situational. Now it's just slap it in everything. Poison Tipped Arrow was better. Poison Tipped Arrow is in everything basically because Poison Tipped Arrow used to be just 2 costs, destroy an Elestral effectively. So it's interesting to see that. We still have Nectar Gods in every deck. Most people cut the Nectar Gods now. Maybe people run 2 tops. Nobody really runs 3 Nectar Gods unless they're doing something super specific. So yeah, it's really interesting again to look at this deck. But this deck is probably the closest to a modern looking deck that we have now, with a few changes you'd make. But 15 Elestrals, 25 runes, that's a fair enough ratio for an aggressive deck. You'd probably want to change up some of your spirit deck ratios here because the Aeolus is more expensive, and you take a Bag of Wind, throwing Gorgon's Gaze instead. It's an interesting deck, and it worked. It worked really well, and it was so frustrating to play against. Exaltair had 4 attack. I completely forgot right there. So yeah, it was just a really frustrating deck to play against, and if you didn't know you were playing against it, you play it like a normal Elestrals game, and all of a sudden your opponent goes, Eruption, Exaltair, and you lose. So when you knew you were playing against it, you could play around it, but yeah, for a while it was brutal. Aggressive Aqua. Water Ram was never good. It might never be good, but man is it a fun deck to play. 1 win, 14 losses. And at the time, Zane was also a very new player to the game, so he's still learning. But it's still interesting to look. So, 20 Elestrals, that's fair for an Ascension deck. The weird part, they pulled the Centaur in here for some reason. There's an Ecolinks in there, I guess, but yeah, 3 Aphros, 3 Foamy, 3 Tadpuff. Standard, basically a ramp package, right? Majesty, Sluggle, Vertaqua, like water ramp package for sure. I don't think Galaxy was out yet, and I don't think Station was out yet, hence why they're not here. Interesting to note though, Sluggle could not be special cast off of Foamy for its regen at the time, making that a lot weaker than it is now. Then we have 20 runes. 2 Tsunami, you'd probably want to run 3 now. Shield Achilles, Circle of the Sky is weird, but it's a ramp deck, so sure, people are experimenting. Earthquake, Nectar Gods, Poseidons, Trident Poseidons, Ambrosias. You'll notice here they run Ecolinks and no way to get extra Earth on board, which is detrimental. And the Centaur with no Foley Forest, so it's why you're running Centaur. Maybe they're trying to do some weird rampy strategy with Earth on the side, but the deck looks similar enough to a ramp deck nowadays, but could definitely use more counter runes, could definitely have used, even at the time, used more counter runes, right? But we didn't know. The game was different. People played differently. But yeah, Majesty Ramp was kind of always a thing. Nowadays, you'd also run Bag of Winds with this deck, so you can get Majesty with a Bag of Winds on it and Trident Poseidon lock. This deck was honestly not great for the time, as you see with the 14 loss, but it's still not too far off from what you would play today. You just make changes to add some wind to the package instead of Earth, and take out things like Circle of the Sky, which no one really uses. But yeah, interesting. Again, we're looking at interesting decks from the past, so it's interesting to see. My deck. Oh boy. So I have 10 wins, 7 losses. I did a lot of games 2, game 3 with this deck. Why does it catch up in Master Control? It was a Leonite Sonicore lock deck. Get both of them out, your opponent can't play counter runes or invoke runes. No one really played a lot of big threats, so you couldn't attack over them. And then to get over Boombat and Kinleo, which were actually played a lot at the time, Hephaestus with Hammer of Hephaestus. So my full board would be Sonicore, Leonite, Hephaestus, and 2 hammers, 1 on each of my Sonicore and Leonites, giving me a bunch of 12 attackers. There was no Pantera yet, or rather Pantera had just been announced. Or the line had just come out, I forget, but I wasn't afraid of Pantera showing up at all, so I wasn't afraid of getting attacked over. So yeah. Oh, and Sorlet targeted at the time, so they couldn't play Sorlet to turn my Leonite or Sonicore to defense position because I would have a hammer on them, making them unable to target. So the deck was like 5-head at the time, because I was just like, and the deck lists were fully known to everyone before the game started, so I was just looking at my opponent's deck list and be like, okay, they have no Invoke Rune, cool, I'll worry about Leonite later, I'll get Sonicore out first, and stuff like that. So it's a deck that worked because I knew my opponent's decks, but you'll notice 24 Elestrals. Really high, even for the time, but I was running 3 Sonicores, 3 Leonites, and I needed to get the combos out. I had Riceros for stall, there's the original Poison-Tipped Arrow there, so you can target Elestral, decrease deck by 2, and then expend 1 to destroy it. It's now expend per cost. And it's just a control deck. Like, I had Spark It in there, but I didn't have anything to use Spark It with, which is okay because it was the old Nexus rules where you could just Nexus off Spark It to discard a card and then do some other shenanigans with the deck. My rune package is a little bit weird because I have 2 Nectar Gods, I need consistency. I had 2 hammers because I needed to get the hammers out. I have Hephaestus because I needed to get Hephaestus with the hammers out ASAP, and then I use Hephaestus plus Kinleo for kind of a backup aggressive strategy. Thunderstorms because I need to make sure I stuck my Elestrals over poison tips. Shield of Achilles for back row. I couldn't really run too much counter runes or too much invoke runes because of Leonite and Sonicore strategies, right? So I had to cut back on them a lot. to really kind of get up for these strategies, but they existed. You know, I have Ambrosius and that. Like, the deck worked really well. I went 5-2 if I recall correctly in this tournament. I only lost to the top 2 decks, I believe. Oh, Mistation did come out. Okay, so Mistation's here in the side deck with no water because against decks that had Thunder Spirit Misenchants for Riceros, I would side in the Mistation for my first play and just misenchant Mistation. So that was a thing way back when we misenchanted Mistation in defense to send into 2-drops with. And my backup, my runes, I had Pandora's Box for a possible Stratamoth. An extra hammer, I don't know why. Gorgon's Gaze in the sideboard because I'm not going to go over again. Gorgon's Gaze was just, it was contentious at the time. And then 3 Resting Your Laurels was also a little contentious at the time. It was definitely a good card. It was not as good as Earthquake. It does the same thing it does now for the most part with some minor changes. But yeah, this is the deck I went 5-2 with and went 3rd in the first Lush tournament with. And it's still kind of, people still bring it up. It's like, oh, you're going to bring the deck back? It's like, the deck won't work nowadays. Because there's too many ways to out Leonite and Tonicore. Like, you could play Viserys with Demeter now. You could play Sorlet and still hit over a hammer because Sorlet doesn't target anymore. Tsunami into Leonite. I mean, you can't do that against Tonicore, but then Tonicore can get outed by the 3 Earthquakes most people run. So, the deck probably wouldn't work today, except for maybe some fun jank. Maybe I'll revisit it in the future. It's a super fun deck. Like, it's still worth playing something similar, but you got to make a lot of changes to make it work nowadays with the current meta, basically. Thunder if necessary. Mutone's Water Thunder deck. So, this is a weird all over the place Ascension water deck. So, it's got Kraken in there, which basically does the same thing it does today. I believe it didn't suppress at the time. It might have just stopped attacks, but basically does the same thing. A Falcane, a Spinosect, 2 Foamy, 2 Clovey, 2 Equalinks. Like, the deck's a little all over the place, but it's basically Water, Wind, Earth with a sideboard for Riceros and Thunderstorm. Like, it's an Ascension deck. 100% they're trying to go for Ascensions. Worth noting, Glauby in this instance. So Glauby was just this tanky threat. I mean, there's Spinosect and Falcane. I can't remember how this deck wins, other than just being heavy on removal and punching you with constant regen and stuff. I really don't remember playing against this deck at all. I know I beat it, but I beat decks just by cheesing them out. But anyway, going to the runes, Point Tipped Arrow, great at the time, Nectar of the Gods. It was always the same. 3 Resting and Laurels, 1 Tsunami, 3 Achilles, 3 Earthquakes, 2 Ambrosia. So that rune package looking pretty similar to today, which probably helped them out. Again, those rune packages, counter meta, even back then, counter runes were even stronger in this tournament. And the very last deck, Apple Discard. So it's a Spark It deck. It's basically like the precursor to Thunder Nexus. I don't believe Toxian existed yet, but we have 3 Amp Up, 1 Lycavol because we like to play Ascensions back then. 2 Riceros because we like to get into 2-drops, and Riceros is great to get into 2-drops. 1 Sonicore, 2 Quackle. Oh, worth noting, Quackle and Sluggle only recovered 2 at the time. 3 Astrabit. Astrabit was still good back then, but Thunder struggled really hard, so Astrabit got buffed and Spark It got buffed. You'll see this Spark It says you can Nexus up to 2 Thunder. If you successful, oh my god, this wording is so different. You can Nexus up to 2 Thunder on your field. If you successfully Nexus from this effect, you can discard a card from your opponent's hand at random. Now you choose. Thunder struggled. I go over this all the time when I'm going over old videos, old decks. Thunder was the worst element in the game at the time. That's why Thunder got buffed. But I went over that multiple times already in different videos. Continuing. There's 3 Boombats. Boombat's the same, it worked. Foamy to float into the 2 cost. Mistation for talk with Sluggle. Kind of a Water Thunder situation. I don't believe Typhline or Ivory existed yet either with this deck, or they'd probably be in this deck too. Runes, 3 Zeus, because Zeus Spark It was still seen as a good combo back then, but not super consistent. Thunderbolt to Zeus's, because you discard all your opponent's invoke threats or your counter threats, and then you start punching into them. I kind of get that. Shield of Achilles, Apple of Discord. Now, Apple of Discord basically did the same thing. Discard 1 card from your hand. Your opponent discards 1 card from your hand. Mills 2. There was a time after this tournament where it became an order to, so it was a Golden Apple used to be a cost to cast, where it would be discard 1 card in order to cast Golden Apple. Now it's back in just I discard, you discard. For first edition, you might see that errata. It was accidentally put into the Kickstarter edition without being changed back, because Golden Apple discard was never great, but just as a safety point, it made it a little bit worse. But now it's back to its original point because it's Golden Apple discord. No one really plays it unless you're playing Fruit. Even then, you only play maybe 1 or 2 a lot of the times, and 1 Ambrosia. Spirit deck, pretty straightforward. After Leviathan, there's no Earthquakes, but they probably could have ran them. And then the sideboard is a bunch of different spirits, and 1 cost Elestrals. So the Wind for the P-Gust in the side deck, Ratakwas for defensive decks, an extra Sluggle for water recovery if they needed it, I guess. 3 Tsunamis and Ambrosias. Tsunamis would definitely be a main deck nowadays, and the Ambrosias generally a main deck nowadays. So yeah, that is all the decks in this tournament. They're wildly different. Like, besides maybe Summer Winds, this aggressive Aqua deck kind of was getting there. My Condiment deck was way off the meta even back then and even now, so it's a little all over the place. This deck's just a troll, but it worked at the time. Like, it's crazy. Like, this deck would not work today. This deck might work today. This deck will not work today. This deck will work. This deck won't work. Won't work. Won't work. Won't work. Like, it's crazy. None of these decks, except for a handful that got lucky / were ahead of the time, would even come close to competing today. And really just, like, Summer Winds, 100% could still compete today. It's still decent, but people are way more cognizant of the burn nowadays. And this counter control deck, we saw a little bit of a variation of it into the little guy stall change, which, because the counter runes became more expensive, your little Elestrals had to be more on the recovery side, and it worked really well for, I forget the guy's name. But lastly, let's just look very briefly at the final standings. So Jade Johnny on his Summer Winds deck obviously took top spot. Axiom, again, that deck that I just said probably would be able to see play today, also took a top spot. My Condiment control deck, I took 3rd, mostly on the back of the deck being, I knew the deck list, so I was able to know my opponent's deck list and play perfectly around their removal options that I knew they had, and then just punch them from there. So because I knew the deck list, it was an open deck list tournament, that deck was bad even back then, but it was a 5-head move where it's like I could play the deck and know what my opponent's playing and just play around their deck perfectly, which will not happen today. So the deck even back then was bad. I only did well with it because I knew my opponent's decks perfectly. Daigen's burn deck, probably because it was a surprising burn out of nowhere kind of strategy, did decent well. Moontone with, what was Moontone on again? The Thunder, if necessary, Thunder Water package kind of worked. Reaper's War, what was he? Thunder discard, right? And then the decks that were bad then, bad now, Fire Cyclops and Zane. It was a fun tournament. I think it's just super interesting to just kind of look back at what these decks were, where Elestrals was in the past, and kind of how we changed to where we are now. It's just a really interesting thing to look at. So yeah, that was the first ever Elestrals tournament. I think it was super interesting to take a peek at that. It's obviously wild that things like Gorgon's Gaze were not played, really. Counter runes were even stronger than they are now, and yeah, it's just interesting to take a peek back at that. So yeah, that's the end of it. I hope you guys enjoyed this kind of retrospective, and I'll see you guys in the next video. If you made it this far and you're not subscribed, whack. See you guys in the next one.